On the morning of August 25th, 1942, a flying boat lifted off the calm waters of a Scottish loch and vanished into the fog. 30 minutes later, it was gone. 14 men were dead, among them a prince. And within hours, the British government began doing something it had never quite done before. It started erasing the evidence. The official story was simple: pilot error, a good crew, a bad day, a tragic accident. The inquiry was sealed, the records disappeared. The sole survivor was visited in hospital by senior RAF officers and never spoke publicly again for the rest of his life. But here is the problem. The more you look at what actually happened on that hillside in Caithness, the less the official story holds together. The plane was off course, the altitude was wrong, there may have been an extra passenger, and the man at the controls, according to the only person who survived, was not the pilot. His name was Prince George, Duke of Kent. He was 39 years old, the younger brother of King George VI, and one of the most complicated men the British royal family has ever produced. Charming, reckless, brilliant, and deeply inconvenient to almost everyone who knew him. This is not just the story of how he died. It is the story of everything the royal family needed to hide before he did. Prince George came into the world on December 20th, 1902, at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate. He was the fourth son, fifth in line to the throne, which in practical terms placed him so far from the crown it was barely visible. The monarchy would have to pass through 4 lives before it ever reached him. That distance was, by royal standards, a kind of freedom, and George would spend his entire life discovering exactly how much trouble freedom could cause. The household he was born into was not a warm one. His father, the future King George V, believed in discipline, hierarchy, and silence. He had been shaped by the Victorian Navy and saw no reason why his sons should be raised any differently. Meals were formal affairs. Affection was given sparingly, if at all. The children addressed their parents with a deference that bordered on fear. His mother, Princess Mary of Teck, was devoted to her husband and her duty, but not conspicuously to her children. She collected antiques with more visible passion than she showed her sons. The palace was full of beautiful objects and very little warmth. George had 5 siblings. Edward, the eldest, was being groomed for kingship. Albert struggled with a debilitating stammer and lived permanently in his older brother's shadow. Henry was solid and steady and entirely unremarkable. Mary, the only daughter, occupied her own separate world of expectation. And then there was John. Prince John was born in 1905. From an early age, something was clearly different. He suffered from epilepsy and what doctors of the time vaguely called developmental delays. As his condition worsened, the royal family made a decision that by modern standards seems almost unbearable. They sent him away. John was moved to a farm on the Sandringham estate, hidden from public life, raised by a governess far from his brothers and sisters. He died in January 1919 at just 13 years old after a severe seizure. The public barely knew he had existed. George watched all of this and understood something very clearly, very early. You could be erased. If you became inconvenient, if you became embarrassing, if you became simply too difficult to explain, you could be quietly removed from the story. It was a lesson he absorbed completely, and one he spent the next 2 decades appearing to ignore entirely. Because where his brothers were trained to disappear into duty, George wanted to be seen. He had a quick mind and natural charm that made tutors take notice, and his mother's ladies in waiting adore him. He loved music, art, and languages. He had opinions, and he expressed them. In a family that valued tradition over curiosity and obedience over personality, George was something close to a scandal before he had done anything scandalous at all. At 13, like every prince before him, He was sent to the Royal Naval College, first to Osborne, then to Dartmouth. The tradition was absolute. Every male member of the family served in the Navy. The fact that George had no interest in any of it was simply irrelevant. He hated it. The rigid schedules, the endless drilling, the suffocating sameness of naval routine. He applied himself well enough at first. His marks were respectable. He excelled at languages and was eventually used as a French interpreter. But the boredom ate at him. The structure felt less like preparation and more like punishment. He began writing to his father, pleading to be released. "I am not cut out for the Navy," he wrote. "I have tried to make him see, but it is no use." King George V refused. His reasoning was simple and total. It had never been done before. No prince had left naval service to pursue something else. Tradition demanded obedience, and obedience demanded silence. George would serve, whether he liked it or not. A family friend, Mabel, Countess of Airlie, recalled George confiding in her at one of the royal race meetings. He told her he was desperately unhappy. He wanted to join the civil service or the Foreign Office. Somewhere he could use his mind. Somewhere he could actually do something. His only reason for refusing, George told her bitterly, is that it has never been done before. "What can I do?" the Countess advised Patience. "Work hard," she said, "complete your service, then present your father with results he cannot argue with." Eventually, painfully, it worked. George's health, which had never been robust, began to fail under the strain. Severe digestive problems plagued him throughout his naval years. Finally, and mercifully, he was discharged. And in a break with centuries of royal tradition, Prince George became the first member of the British royal family to work as a civil servant. He had escaped one cage, but freedom, as he was about to discover, came with dangers of its own. When George left the Navy in 1929, he did what any young prince with money, charm, and no particular responsibilities would do. He moved in with his favourite brother. Edward, the Prince of Wales, kept a residence at York House in London. It was supposed to be a respectable establishment. In practice, it was something between a jazz club and a carnival. Edward filled it with parties, cocktails, music that went until dawn, and a rotating collection of glamorous companions who had no business being within a mile of the future king. George moved under that roof and inhaled deeply. The two brothers had always been close despite the 8 years between them. They shared the same restless energy, the same impatience with protocol, the same appetite for a world the palace had no interest in understanding. London in the late 1920s offered all of it. The war had shattered the old certainties. Jazz clubs had bloomed across the West End. Cocktails flowed in establishments hidden behind unmarked doors. And beneath the glittering surface, a world existed that Victorian England had tried to legislate out of existence. A world where men loved men and women loved women, despite laws that could send them to prison for it. George discovered that world, and he did not tiptoe into it. It started with the nightclubs. He became a regular at the most fashionable establishments in London, surrounded by actresses, socialites, and aristocrats who shared his taste for danger. He was seen with Poppy Baring, a banking heiress his parents found entirely unsuitable. There were affairs with Hollywood stars, with cabaret singers. His name appeared in connection with the actress Tallulah Bankhead, the legendary Florence Mills, Gloria Swanson. His conquest became the material of whispered legend. But women were only part of the story. In the early 1920s, George met a man who would alter the entire direction of his private life. His name was Noel Coward. Coward was a playwright, an actor, a wit whose sharp tongue spared absolutely no one. He was flamboyant, theatrical, and completely at home in circles where homosexuality was an open secret. he was also irresistible. What began as friendship quickly became something more. According to multiple accounts, George and Coward carried on a relationship that would last nearly 2 decades. They wrote each other letters, intimate letters, the kind of correspondence that could have destroyed a prince entirely. And George was not careful. British security services maintained files on members of the royal family. The reports on George made for alarming reading. Agents observed him and Coward walking through the streets of London dressed as women, full makeup, women's clothing, 2 of the most recognisable men in England parading through the West End in drag. On at least one occasion, they were allegedly arrested. The charge was suspected prostitution. When police realised they had the king's son in custody, George was quietly released. No charges filed, no record kept. The incident buried. It was not the only one. There were alleged affairs with the writer Cecil Roberts, rumours about Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, a cousin. And then there was Anthony Blunt, an art historian and Cambridge intellectual who moved easily through the upper reaches of British society. He and George allegedly became close during this period. Blunt would later become surveyor of the King's pictures, responsible for the royal art collection. He would also be exposed, decades afterward, as a Soviet spy. One of the infamous Cambridge Five who had been passing secrets to Moscow throughout the Cold War. The Queen's own art curator, a traitor, and possibly, once upon a time, the lover of her uncle. George's father knew something was wrong. King George V was not a subtle man, but he was not a fool either. He saw the late nights, he heard the whispers. He understood, on some level, what his son was. According to one account, the king made a dark joke about the situation. He suggested that George should be assigned a ballerina as his aide-de-camp so that nothing scandalous could happen. It was cruel humour, the kind that acknowledges a truth by pretending to dismiss it. But the joke stopped when George met Kiki Preston. She was American. She was beautiful. She was connected to some of the wealthiest families in the United States, and she carried a nickname that told you everything you needed to know about the danger she represented. They called her the girl with the silver syringe. Born Alice Gwynne in 1898, she had married into a banking family and then drifted into the orbit of what became known as the Happy Valley Set, a community of wealthy British expatriates in the Kenyan Highlands who had fled the constraints of English society for a place where every appetite could be satisfied without consequence. The parties were legendary. The affairs were constant. The drugs flowed freely. Kiki fit in perfectly. She had earned her nickname through her preferred method of administration. While others smoked or snorted, Kiki injected. Heroin delivered through a syringe she allegedly kept polished to a shine. George met her in the mid-1920s, and the attraction was instant. Kiki was everything he craved. Glamorous, utterly uninhibited, completely indifferent to the judgment of others. What she introduced him to nearly destroyed him entirely. Morphine first, then cocaine, then heroin. The prince who had spent his life searching for stimulation had finally found something that delivered it directly into his bloodstream. He was hooked almost immediately. There were parties that lasted for days, binges that left him unable to function. The royal family watched in horror. His father had tolerated the nightclubs and looked the other way at the whispers about his son's sexuality. But addiction was different. This was visible. This was dangerous. This could not be concealed indefinitely. It was Edward who finally intervened. They had lived together, covered for each other, shared more than brothers ordinarily share. But Edward recognised that George had crossed a line from which there was no quiet return. He confronted Kiki Preston directly. The exact details vary depending on the source. Some say Kiki had suffered a miscarriage, possibly carrying George's child. Others say Edward simply demanded she leave England and never make contact with his brother again. Whatever the conversation actually contained, she left. The addiction remained. Edward took personal charge of his brother's rehabilitation. George was moved to a country estate far from London. A nursing staff was brought in. He was, in every meaningful sense, imprisoned for his own protection. Edward wrote about it to his mistress, Freda Dudley Ward, with a mix of exasperation and love that is almost painful to read. "The cure has reached a rather tricky stage," he confided. "I'm carrying out the work of doctor, jailer and detective combined. He seems to lack all sense of knowing what is so obviously the wrong thing to do." The withdrawal was brutal. George suffered through weeks of it, but Edward refused to give up, and eventually George emerged on the other side, clean enough to function, clean enough to be presentable, clean enough to return. But the damage he had left scattered across London and Paris had not gone anywhere. Because throughout those years of reckless living, George had been astonishingly careless. He wrote letters to his lovers, passionate and intimate and completely compromising. He gave gifts with personal inscriptions. He posed for photographs that no member of the royal family should ever have allowed to exist. And now that evidence was scattered across half of Europe, waiting. The blackmail attempts began in the early 1930s. One of the most serious involved a French architect with whom George had been romantically involved. The man possessed materials and made clear he expected compensation for his silence. Buckingham Palace mobilized. 2 emissaries were dispatched to Paris on direct orders from the king. They broke into the architect's apartment, located a gold box with a personal inscription on the lid, along with several letters in George's handwriting, and returned to London without leaving a trace. The architect was presumably paid or threatened into permanent silence. The evidence was destroyed, but it kept happening. The letters to Noel Coward alone represented a vulnerability that terrified the palace. For nearly 2 decades, the prince had poured his heart onto paper. Coward had kept everything. They were precious to him. But their existence was, from the palace's perspective, catastrophic. In 1942, someone decided the risk could no longer be tolerated. Lord Beaverbrook, the powerful press baron and wartime minister, allegedly arranged for the letters to be stolen from Coward's home in Belgravia. Coward was devastated and powerless. Years later, Beaverbrook's daughter admitted she had once seen the letters in her father's safe. After his death in 1964, they were never found. There were other incidents, other payoffs, other urgent missions to retrieve evidence before it reached the wrong hands. A male prostitute in Paris had reportedly acquired additional letters that had to be repurchased at considerable cost. The royal machine worked constantly, invisibly, to contain the wreckage the prince left behind. By the early 1930s, the family had reached a simple conclusion. George needed a wife. The search was not left to chance or sentiment. It was handled like a diplomatic appointment. George had been linked to women the palace considered entirely unsuitable. What was needed was a princess with the right bloodline, the right composure, and ideally, the right temperament to manage a man who had demonstrated repeatedly that he could not manage himself. They found her in Princess Marina of Greece. Marina was born in Athens in December 1906, the daughter of Prince Nicholas of Greece. Through her father, she descended from the royal houses of Denmark and Greece. Through her mother, she was connected directly to the Romanov dynasty. Her pedigree was flawless, but Marina was more than a list of titles. She was intelligent, extraordinarily stylish, and possessed of a sophistication that came from a childhood spent in exile. Political upheaval had forced her family out of Greece when she was still young. They had lived in Switzerland, then Paris, moving through the drawing rooms of dispossessed European royalty. Marina had learned to adapt, to survive, to charm. She spoke multiple languages fluently and dressed with a precision that made headlines. George and Marina first met at a lunch party in 1933. The attraction was not immediate. George, reportedly, found her bossy. She found him charming but complicated. Something sparked anyway, and they agreed to meet again. When Marina returned to England the following spring, they went to the cinema together. They danced at the Embassy Club on Bond Street. George took her for long drives in his sports car, pushing the speedometer while Marina refused to flinch. They walked in Green Park for hours. Gradually, the relationship became something real. "She is the one woman with whom I could be happy to spend the rest of my life," George told friends. "We laugh at the same things. She beats me at most games, and she doesn't give a damn how fast I drive." The wedding took place on November 29, 1934, at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding broadcast on radio, and millions across the empire listened. George, now created Duke of Kent, stood at the altar with his brothers on either side. Afterward, they stepped onto the balcony to wave at the cheering crowds. It was the first time royals had done so after a wedding, a tradition born from a marriage the palace had arranged as damage control. Britain fell in love with them instantly. George and Marina became the celebrity couple of their era. Their parties drew artists and intellectuals. Marina's fashion choices were reproduced across the country. George's elegantly cut double-breasted suits became so associated with him that the style was simply called the Kent. For a brief, glittering moment, it seemed as though the chaos had been contained. Then the world fell apart. In January 1936, King George V died. Edward ascended to the throne. It should have been a moment of continuity and stability. Instead, it became the abdication crisis. Edward was in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee the establishment refused to accept as a future queen. He was given a choice: give up Wallis or give up the throne. He chose Wallis. When he signed the instrument of abdication in December 1936, George was in the room as a witness, watching his closest brother sign away everything for a woman the rest of the family despised. Albert became King George VI, unprepared, terrified. For a brief moment there was even quiet conversation about whether Albert might be passed over entirely. His health was fragile, his nerves were shattered. Some whispered that perhaps George, the capable and charming fourth son, should take the throne instead. It never happened. Albert steadied himself. George remained the Duke of Kent. And then there was the question of Germany. Throughout the 1930s, a significant faction of the British establishment believed that war with Germany could and should be prevented. They feared communism more than fascism. They believed a negotiated peace was possible. This faction included aristocrats, politicians, businessmen, and members of the royal family. Edward, before his abdication, had been openly sympathetic to Hitler's Germany. He and Wallis were photographed giving Nazi salutes during a visit in 1937. George's position was more ambiguous, more dangerous. Some historians argue he was connected to what they call the Anglo-German Peace Group, that he met with Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy during the 1930s, that he held back-channel discussions with Prince Philip of Hesse, who served as Hitler's personal diplomatic intermediary in early 1939. The goal, supposedly, was to prevent the war through private negotiation. And then came May 10, 1941. Rudolf Hess climbed into a fighter plane in Germany and flew alone to Scotland. He parachuted onto a farm, was captured by a bewildered farmer, and asked to see the Duke of Hamilton. His stated purpose was to negotiate peace between Britain and Germany. Churchill dismissed him immediately as a madman. He spent the rest of the war in prison and died in Spandau in 1987. The official story has always been that Hess acted alone, driven by delusion. But some historians have never accepted it. The authors of a book called Double Standards argue that Hess expected to be received by sympathetic figures in the British establishment, that his flight was not madness but a planned mission that went wrong, and that among those who were supposed to welcome him was Prince George, Duke of Kent, who was reportedly in Scotland when Hess arrived. Other historians reject the theory entirely. A biography of George published in recent years argues he was actively anti-fascist, that he worked with MI6 to expose Nazi sympathisers, and that the conspiracy theories collapse under scrutiny. The truth remains buried in classified files the British government has never fully released. What is certain is this: when war came, George served. He joined the Royal Air Force. He visited bases across Britain, shaking hands with crews, boosting morale, doing the quiet and unglamorous work of keeping hope functional. He became friends with Franklin Roosevelt. When his third child, Prince Michael, was born in July 1942, the American president agreed to serve as godfather. George had ambitions to become a formal liaison between British and American air forces. He saw in the role something he had searched for his entire life: real purpose. He had 21 days left to live. On the afternoon of August 24, 1942, George kissed Marina goodbye. Their son Michael was just 7 weeks old. Their other children, Edward and Alexandra, were thriving. Despite everything happening beyond the walls of their country house in Buckinghamshire, life held a fragile kind of peace. George held his infant son one final time, then left for London to board a train north. He was going to Scotland. From there, he would fly to Iceland to inspect RAF bases and raise the spirits of the men stationed in that remote and freezing posting. It was the kind of routine mission he had carried out many times. But the Iceland trip was meant to be more than routine. General Carl Spaatz, commander of the American 8th Air Force, had suggested George visit American bases there. If all went well, Spaatz would formally request his services as a permanent liaison officer. It was exactly the work George had always wanted. He arrived at RAF Invergordon on the morning of August 25th. The aircraft was a short Sunderland Mark III, a large maritime flying boat built for long-range patrols. The crew had been carefully selected. Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen, an experienced Australian pilot, was in command. Wing Commander Thomas Moseley, the commanding officer of 228 Squadron, had joined as a courtesy to the Duke. The remaining men were navigators, engineers and gunners, professionals, hand-picked. George had lunch with the station commander, was ferried out to the aircraft by motor launch, and around 1 o'clock in the afternoon he boarded. Minutes later, the Sunderland began taxiing across the calm waters. The conditions were not ideal. Low cloud and fog clung to the coastline, but the weather was expected to improve once they cleared the Scottish coast and reached the open Atlantic. At 10 minutes past 1, the flying boat lifted off. What happened in the next 30 minutes has never been satisfactorily explained. The aircraft was supposed to fly out over the North Sea, keeping well clear of land entirely. Instead, it turned inland. For reasons no official inquiry ever convincingly resolved, the plane veered off its planned course and flew directly toward the Scottish Highlands. It descended to an altitude of just 700 feet, moving blind through thick fog over terrain that rose sharply and suddenly beneath it. At 42 minutes past 1, 30 minutes after takeoff, the Sunderland struck the side of a hill called Eagle's Rock near Dunbeath in Caithness. A local man named Hugh Morrison was searching for sheep on the moorland with his son when they heard the aircraft somewhere above them in the fog. They could not see it. Then came the sound, a massive explosion that shook the ground. a wall of flame erupted into the grey sky as thousands of gallons of aviation fuel ignited simultaneously. Morrison sprinted to his motorcycle and rode to raise the alarm. Search parties set out immediately, but the terrain was rough and the crash site remote. It took hours to reach what was left. The aircraft had struck the rising slope at full speed, cartwheeled across the heather, and broken apart as it burned. Bodies were scattered across 200 yards of scorched hillside. The impact had been so violent that the plane was essentially unrecognizable. 14 of the 15 men aboard were dead. Dr. Kennedy, the local physician, was among the first to reach the scene. George was immediately recognizable despite the injuries, but it was the identity bracelet that removed any doubt. His Royal Highness, the Duke of Kent. The sole survivor was Sergeant Andrew Jack, the rear gunner. His position in the tail turret, considered the most dangerous spot on the aircraft, had, ironically, saved him. When the plane broke apart on impact, the tail section sheared away and Jack was thrown clear, landing in the soft heather while the rest of the aircraft exploded around him. He was badly injured, but alive. Jack was visited in hospital by senior RAF officials. Whatever was said during that conversation guaranteed his silence for the rest of his life. He refused to discuss the crash publicly until his death, but in private to his family, he apparently said something quite different. According to Jack's niece, who spoke years later, the rear gunner confided that it was not the pilot at the controls when the plane went down. It was Prince George. Jack claimed he had dragged the Duke's body from the pilot's seat after the crash. He also said there had been an additional person aboard, someone whose identity was never officially recorded and whose name appeared on no manifest. Who that person was has never been established. The Court of Inquiry convened 3 days after the crash. Its proceedings were conducted entirely in secret. The families of the 14 dead men were not permitted to attend. The official finding was pilot error. Flight Lieutenant Goyen, the experienced Australian who had completed countless missions without incident, was held responsible for flying off course and at an unsafe altitude. The documents were sealed. When researchers later attempted to access those records, they discovered that all materials related to the inquiry had vanished entirely. The official story was closed. The questions refused to close with it. The news reached Balmoral on the evening of August 25th. King George VI was on holiday with his family when the telephone rang. His brother was dead. The king, who had never wanted the throne and had been thrust into it by one brother's recklessness, now had to absorb the loss of another. "It came as a great shock to me," he wrote in his diary that night. "We left Balmoral in the evening for London. Queen Mary, George's mother, was 75 years old. She had already lost her husband and watched one son destroy himself through scandal. Now another was gone. I could not believe it," she wrote. Her first thought was for Marina. She found her daughter-in-law alternating between uncontrollable sobbing and a blank, empty stillness. Marina was 35 years old, 7 weeks out of childbirth, a widow with 3 children under the age of 7, and a husband whose body had been pulled from burning wreckage on a remote Scottish hillside. The funeral took place on August 29th at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Marina was supported on either side by the 2 queens as she was escorted to her place at the high altar. She wore black. She could barely stand. The coffin entered the chapel draped with George's personal standard. On top rested his Air Commodore's cap and a wreath of flowers that Marina had cut herself from the garden at their country home. She had placed them there with her own hands. Among the mourners was Noel Coward. The man who had loved George for nearly 20 years sat in the congregation and watched the coffin pass. He had tried to comfort Marina in the days after the crash, but he was himself inconsolable. When the coffin moved through the chapel, he later wrote, He recalled the flowers from the garden and the cap resting on top of them, and he was, he said simply, finished. 3 weeks after the funeral, the king drove from Balmoral to the crash site. He stood on the scorched hillside for a long time, alone, looking at what remained. The ground for 200 yards in every direction had been scored and blackened. He tried to reconstruct in his mind what must have happened. He found he could not. In the decades that followed, the royal family never commissioned an official biography of George. No statue was erected, no hospital named in his memory, no memorial built to mark the fact that he had been the first member of the family to die in active service in 4.5 centuries. They let him fade. They let the questions fade with him. But the questions did not cooperate. Why was the plane off course? Why was it flying at 700 feet through fog over mountains? Who was the unidentified passenger? Was George really at the controls? What did the surviving airman see that required him to spend the rest of his life in silence? Why did the inquiry documents disappear? Was the crash an accident? Was it something else? And if it was something else, what exactly was someone trying to prevent? There are no clean answers. There may never be. The files that might have provided them are gone. The men who knew the truth are dead. The institution that had the most to lose from a full accounting of George's life and death has never shown any inclination to provide one. What we are left with is this: a prince who lived with extraordinary recklessness and died with extraordinary convenience, a family that chose silence over commemoration almost immediately, a crash that made no navigational sense, a surviving witness who was silenced, and a mystery sealed so thoroughly that decades of researchers have found nothing at the centre of it except the absence of what should have been there. That absence is itself the answer to something. We are just not entirely sure yet what the question was. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was buried at Frogmore in the royal grounds at Windsor. The grave is quiet and largely unvisited. There is no grand monument, no plaque that explains who he was or what his life contained. Just a name and a date, which is, when you think about it, exactly how the royal family wanted it.